The sound that broke her was not the slam of a door. It was the quiet, deliberate click of it locking. Abby Sutton had been crying silently over the cold granite of the executive kitchen counter for the better part of 10 minutes, pressing a fistful of paper towels against her split lip and telling herself, in the practiced, hollow way of someone who had done it many times before, that she was fine. She was always fine. She had to be fine. There was no one else left to be fine for the two of them. She hadn't expected anyone to be in the Hargrove building at 2:47 in the morning. The 41st floor was dead. The cleaning crew had finished the East Wing an hour ago. The last of the senior staff, the ones with keycards that actually worked on the executive elevator, had taken their briefcases and their imported whiskey and left well before midnight. Abby had been counting on that. She had slipped into the private executive kitchen because it was the one room in the building where the security cameras pointed at the exterior windows, not the interior. She had needed somewhere to fall apart that wasn't a bathroom stall. What she had not counted on was Mateo Hargrove. He stood just inside the door, one hand still resting on the brushed steel handle, his charcoal suit jacket folded over his forearm. He hadn't announced himself. He hadn't cleared his throat. He had simply materialized in the frame of the door like a shadow that had learned to wear a Patek Philippe watch, and now his dark eyes were fixed on her face with an intensity that made the cold room feel suddenly, unbearably smaller. Abby spun toward the window, pressing her wrist to her lips. Her heart slammed against her ribs. "Mr. Hargrove." Her voice came out fractured, the professional steadiness she had spent 11 months carefully constructing dissolving in about half a second. "I apologize. I was just leaving. I only needed the ice maker. I'll be out of your way." "Stop." One word. Low, unhurried, the kind of voice that had never in its life needed to be raised to be obeyed. Abby stopped. She heard him set his jacket down on one of the bar stools. She heard the slow, deliberate sound of his footsteps crossing the polished concrete floor toward her. Every rational part of her brain was screaming at her to come up with something, an excuse, a story, anything, but her mind had gone completely, embarrassingly blank. He stopped a few feet behind her. "Turn around, Abby." It was the first time he had ever used her first name. In 11 months of making his 6 a.m. coffee exactly 3 centimeters from the top of the glass, of rerouting his calls and declining his meetings and memorizing the precise cadence of his schedule down to the minute, he had called her Miss Sutton. Always Miss Sutton. Clean, impersonal, professional, like the rest of his world. She turned around because there was nothing else to do. Mateo Hargrove's gaze dropped immediately to her mouth. The split in her lower lip was still oozing slightly, and the skin along her cheekbone had begun to swell with the slow, heavy certainty of a bruise settling in for the long term. She watched the muscle in his jaw go tight. He looked at her the way men like him looked at problems, with a cold, surgical focus that had nothing gentle in it and everything deliberate. "Who did that?" he said. It wasn't really a question. It was the beginning of a sentence he was finishing somewhere behind his eyes. "I walked into a door." The lie came out automatically, the same one she had used twice before in the past 8 months, once for a co-worker who noticed, once for her landlord. "I was distracted." "It's nothing, Abby." He said her name again, quieter this time, and somehow that was worse. He took one step closer, and she was suddenly acutely aware of how tall he was, how the overhead light carved the sharp angles of his face into something almost severe. He reached out slowly, giving her time to move if she wanted to, and tilted her chin up with 2 fingers, not gripping, just enough pressure to keep her from looking away. "I have been in business negotiations for 22 years. I know what a door does to a face, and I know what a fist does." His thumb brushed the edge of her uninjured cheek, barely a touch. "I am going to ask you one more time." The gentleness of it was what undid her. Not his authority, not his money or the building that bore his family's name on 4 sides. The simple, unbearable fact that no one had touched her like that in a very long time. Her eyes filled before she could stop them. Abby Sutton had not planned to spend her 29th year as the only thing standing between her younger brother and a pair of men who wore expensive sneakers and carried debt collection as casually as a hobby. 2 years ago, she had been finishing her 2nd semester of a graduate program in public health at Georgetown, living on dining hall coffee and the specific, bright-edged optimism of someone who believed that working hard enough could outrun anything. That was before her brother Declan called her from a county lockup in Baltimore at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, and everything she had been building quietly collapsed. Declan was 22 and smarter than anyone gave him credit for, and absolutely catastrophically bad at making decisions when he felt cornered. He had borrowed $40,000 from a man named Cresswell. No first name, just Cresswell. The kind of name people use when they want to sound like a natural disaster, to cover a debt that had spiraled out of a card game he never should have been at. Cresswell's organization was not the kind of operation that negotiated payment plans. It was the kind of operation that sent two men named things like Rook and Garrett to wait outside a person's mother's house at 7 in the morning. Abby had pulled out of Georgetown. She had taken the best-paying job she could find with the fastest start date, which turned out to be executive assistant to Matteo Hargrove, CEO of Hargrove Capital Group, a private equity firm that managed, depending on which publication you believed, somewhere between $3 and $8 billion in assets, and whose 41st floor offices in downtown Chicago felt like the inside of a very tasteful terrarium for apex predators. She had been transferring 60% of every paycheck directly to Cresswell's account since the first month. She had 7 months left on the repayment schedule. She had been very careful. She'd been a ghost, just like the job required her to be, efficient and invisible, and without a personal life that could be used as leverage. She had been doing so well, until tonight, when a man named Rook had been waiting in the parking garage of her apartment building at 10 p.m. to inform her, in the specific calm language of a person for whom violence is administrative, that the payment schedule was being accelerated. Cresswell wanted the remaining balance in 96 hours, $31,000, by Friday. When Abby had told him that was impossible, Rook had demonstrated what impossible felt like against her face. She told Matteo Hargrove all of it. She didn't mean to. She had meant to keep saying nothing. But there was something about the way he was looking at her, not with pity, not with the faintly horrified discomfort of someone calculating how this would affect their schedule, that made the wall she had spent 2 years carefully building give way all at once, the way walls do when they have been holding too much for too long. The words came out in the wrong order, tumbling over each other. The card game and Georgetown and 60% of every paycheck and the parking garage and the name Cresswell and the name Rook and $31,000 and 96 hours and Declan, her brother, who didn't know any of this and who was currently asleep in a studio apartment in Pilsen, and who could not, under any circumstances, find out that the reason she was standing in her boss's private kitchen at 3 in the morning with a split lip was because of a debt he'd forgotten he left her. Matteo listened to all of it without moving. When she was done, the kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. The city 41 floors below threw pale orange light against the windows. "A man named Rook," Matteo said finally, his voice even and uninflected, "put his hands on you, in the parking garage of your apartment building. Yes, tonight, yes." He turned away from her then, resting both hands flat on the granite island. He stared at the middle distance for a long moment, something moving behind his expression that she couldn't quite read. When he spoke again, his voice had gone somewhere very quiet and very cold. "You've been paying $40,000 in criminal extortion, using your salary from my company." She felt the floor shift slightly under the wording of that. "I know how it sounds. It sounds," Matteo said, "like you have been blackmailed into servicing a debt that isn't yours, and that you have been doing it alone for 2 years, without telling anyone." He turned his head to look at her over his shoulder, "and that someone put his hands on my executive assistant in a parking garage tonight, and thought there would be no consequences for it." Abby didn't have anything to say to that. She had never once heard him use the word consequences in a tone that wasn't perfectly composed, and the way it landed now felt significantly different from any boardroom she had ever been in. Matteo picked up his jacket from the bar stool and reached into the inner pocket. He pulled out a phone, matte black, no case, the kind of device that looked like it had been built specifically for him, and made a call. 1 ring. A Fowler, his voice dropped into the flat operational register of someone issuing instructions, not making conversation. "I need current addresses and full organizational maps on a debt collection outfit operating under a man named Cresswell. Chicago. Connected to card operations. He has an enforcer called Rook. Find out his real name and whether he has priors. I also need you to pull the feed from the Elmwood parking garage on West Monroe. Tonight, 10 p.m. corridor. Get me everything." A pause. "No now," he ended the call. He looked at Abby. "You're not going back to that apartment tonight," he said. "It was not a suggestion. Mr. Hargrove, I can't just. You are the only person who can identify the man who assaulted you. That makes your physical location relevant to me." He said it with such matter-of-fact authority that for a moment it almost sounded like a legal rationale, and she almost didn't notice that his eyes had moved to her lip again, and that the muscle in his jaw had tightened again. "There is a guest room on the residential floor. You'll stay there tonight. Tomorrow, we address the situation. Declan can't know. Your brother will not know anything until you decide he should." He crossed the kitchen and retrieved the small first aid kit mounted inside the cabinet to the left of the sink, the one Abby herself had restocked 2 weeks ago, because it was on her list of things to maintain. He brought it to the island and set it in front of her without ceremony. Sit. She sat on one of the bar stools, mostly because her legs had decided they were done making decisions for the evening. Matteo Hargrove opened the first aid kit and removed an antiseptic wipe with the calm, methodical precision of a man who was either a closet medic or simply someone who approached everything in the world with the same focused attention. He stood in front of her, and the height difference was suddenly very apparent, and she had the disorienting sense of being simultaneously very small and very seen. "This is going to sting," he said. "I know." She had put enough antiseptic on enough of her own injuries over the past 2 years to have opinions about which brands stung more. He pressed it carefully to the cut on her lower lip. She hissed through her teeth. He didn't apologize, but he slowed his hand. "Cresswell," he said quietly, his eyes on the injury. "That's a name that comes up in connection with 3 separate underground operations the city's financial crimes unit has been building cases against for the past 18 months. Your brother walked into something with a longer reach than a card game." Abby blinked. "How do you know that?" "Because 2 of those operations attempted to acquire companies I was considering for portfolio. I make it a point to know the landscape." He tossed the used wipe and pressed a thin, adhesive closure to the cut with the same unhurried care. "Cresswell has been careful. He keeps civilian debtors as buffer, people like your brother, people who have something to lose. It insulates him from direct exposure." He looked up and met her eyes. "You were never going to pay your way out, Abby. That's not what this was." The cold spread slowly through her chest. "What do you mean?" The accelerated timeline. 96 hours. An amount you obviously can't produce in cash that quickly. His expression didn't change, but his voice went quieter. "He was going to use your inability to pay as justification for a different kind of collection." Declan. The word hit her like a physical thing. "He was going to take my brother," she said. "As leverage, yes. It's a pattern." Matteo closed the first aid kit with a soft click. "Which is why we're handling this now, before Friday exists as a deadline." She looked at him. Really looked at him, the way she had spent 11 months carefully not doing because he was her employer and the kind of man you built professional walls around, because the alternative was complicated. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the boardroom composure, not the concentrated intensity he pointed at balance sheets and acquisition targets. Something older and more direct than either of those things. "Why?" she asked. "Why does this matter to you?" The question sat between them for a moment. "Because you work for me," Matteo said. "And what happens to people in my company is my concern." He paused, just barely. "And because a man named Rook put his hands on you tonight and thought that was something he was entitled to do." He didn't elaborate. But the way he said it, the quiet, final precision of it, told her that Rook was going to have the specific, lasting experience of having been very wrong about that. She didn't sleep, exactly. She lay in the guest room on the residential floor, a room that smelled like cedar and unused hours, with sheets that had a thread count she had no reference point for, and stared at the ceiling and tried to process the previous 4 hours of her life. At some point before dawn, she must have drifted off, because she woke to pale grey light and the smell of coffee, and a light knock on the door. It was Nina, one of the building's overnight staff, carrying a tray with a ceramic pot of the specific Ethiopian blend Abby herself ordered for the office every 2 weeks, 2 slices of toast, and a folded set of clothes that were clearly not from the building's lost and found. "Mr. Hargrove asked me to bring this up," Nina said, keeping her eyes professionally neutral. "He's expecting you in the conference room on 40 when you're ready." Abby looked at the clothes. A soft grey sweater, dark trousers, and a pair of simple flats, all clearly purchased at some point in the past few hours. She thought about asking how he had known her size, and then decided she was too tired to be surprised by competence. 20 minutes later, she stepped off the executive elevator into a floor that had been transformed overnight. She was used to the 41st floor as a place of controlled, expensive quiet. This morning it had the focused, low-frequency energy of a place where serious decisions were being made quickly. 3 men she didn't recognize sat at workstations in the secondary conference room, their screens covered in what looked like financial documents and satellite imagery. Matteo's personal attorney, a woman named Claudia Reyes, whom Abby had scheduled meetings with dozens of times but never actually spoken to, was on a phone call in the glass-walled office by the south windows. A man in a dark jacket who had the general posture of someone who had at some point been employed by a government that didn't discuss its operations stood near the elevator bank. And he nodded at Abby in a way that suggested he had been briefed on who she was. Matteo was in the main conference room, standing over a long table covered in documents, a tablet, and 2 open laptops. He looked up when she entered. His eyes moved to the bruise on her cheek, briefly, the way they kept doing, as if checking something, inventorying a wrong that still needed correcting. "Sit," he said. "There's coffee." She sat. She poured coffee into one of the cups on the table and wrapped both hands around it. "Fowler confirmed identity overnight," Matteo said, not looking up from the documents. He was addressing both her and the man from the elevator bank who had followed her in and closed the door. "Rook's actual name is Gregory Hess. 2 prior assault charges, 1 dismissed. He operates collection for Cresswell across 4 zip codes on the north and south sides. The parking garage footage is clean. It's admissible." He looked up. "Abby, your brother's original debt, the card game. Who arranged the game?" She blinked. "I don't know. Declan said it was someone from his old job. Name of the job? He was doing dispatch for a freight company, Lakeshore Logistics." Something shifted in Matteo's expression. He looked at the man by the door, whose name, she would later learn, was Townsend, and something passed between them that she couldn't quite read. "Lakeshore Logistics folded its Chicago operation 14 months ago," Matteo said, setting down the paper he was holding. "Its holding company was a shell registered in Delaware with a registered agent that also appears on the paperwork for 2 of Cresswell's known front businesses." He looked at Abby directly. "Your brother didn't stumble into a card game. He was recruited. Lakeshore was a feeder operation. They identified young men with financial pressure and no institutional support, brought them into the card games, and when they were deep enough in debt, they transferred the obligation to Cresswell." The coffee cup felt very heavy in her hands. Declan was targeted before he walked through the door. Matteo said it without softening it. He had, she was realizing, the rare quality of someone who understood that the truth delivered plainly was a form of respect, which means the $40,000 was never going to disappear, regardless of how carefully you paid. It would have been extended, accelerated, restructured. They had leverage and they intended to keep it. Abby set the cup down. Her hands were very steady. She found that a bit remarkable under the circumstances. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "The same thing I do when someone tries to use a position of manufactured debt to extract value from a company I own." He came around the table and sat across from her, resting his forearms on the surface, his attention fixed entirely on her. "I remove their ability to collect. Permanently." The plan as it unfolded over the next 40 minutes was not what she had expected. She had half imagined something in the vein of a very expensive lawyer, making a problem go away quietly. What Matteo laid out was something considerably more methodical. Townsend's team had overnight mapped Cresswell's full civilian debt portfolio. There were 63 names on it, people across the city who were in versions of Declan's situation, all of them quietly bleeding. Claudia Reyes was coordinating with a federal financial crimes attorney who had been building a parallel case. The parking garage footage of Gregory Hess assaulting Abby was the first clean piece of evidentiary footage they'd ever had with a direct connection to Cresswell's enforcement arm. The whole architecture of it, she realized, had been waiting for one clean thread to pull. "You're not doing this because of me," she said slowly. "I'm doing it because it's been sitting in my peripheral vision for 18 months, and tonight you gave me a reason to act instead of watch." He met her eyes. "But I am also doing it because of you. Both things are true." She looked at him for a long moment. "My brother," she said. "He needs to be somewhere safe before this moves. Already arranged, Townsend." The man by the door produced a phone and handed it to her. On the screen was an address in Evanston, a photo of a building that looked quiet and private and entirely nondescript, and a text thread showing that a man named Callum on Matteo's staff had made contact with Declan 40 minutes ago under the pretext of a building inspection at Declan's apartment, requiring him to relocate for 2 days. Declan had apparently accepted this with the casual ease of a 22-year-old who had no reason yet to question logistics arranged for him. Abby stared at the phone. The weight she had been carrying for 2 years, the 60% in the Friday envelopes and the calculations she ran constantly, quietly, in the background of every other thought, lifted so abruptly that she felt, briefly, absurdly dizzy. "You moved him last night," she said. At 4 a.m., she looked up. She felt the thing she had been holding in place by sheer structural willpower start to give, and she pressed her fingers hard against the edge of the conference table and breathed carefully. "You don't know my brother," she said. "You had no reason to. He's your family," Matteo said, as if that were the entirety of the logic. "And you have been carrying this alone, without asking anyone for anything for 2 years. That ends now." He said it with the same flat, irrefutable certainty he used for closing arguments in acquisition meetings, as if the matter were already decided and the universe simply hadn't gotten the memo yet. She didn't cry. She had done her crying the night before, alone in a kitchen that wasn't hers, and she was not going to do it again in front of a man who ran $8 billion and wore suits that cost more than her monthly rent. But she felt something in her chest unlock, very quietly, like a door that had been bolted for so long the hinges had rusted, and the air on the other side was unexpectedly cool. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he nodded once and reached for his coffee, and the professional efficiency of the room reassembled itself around them. It was the young paralegal from Claudia's team who, 4 hours later, handed Abby a coffee without being asked, and then did a visible double-take and said, with the startled sincerity of someone who hadn't thought about what they were saying before they said it, "Funny that you knew Cresswell had a second operation in Wicker Park before Fowler pulled the records. Claudia said you knew the Wicker Park address right away." Abby set her cup down. She had not known that. She hadn't said anything about Wicker Park. She had given Matteo the name Cresswell and the name Rook and the parking garage, and that was the entirety of what she'd provided. She went back through every word of the previous 4 hours in her head with the fast, quiet precision of someone who had spent 2 years surviving on attention to detail. The only people who knew about the Wicker Park operation were Fowler's team, Claudia's team, Townsend, and the 3 men at the workstations, whom Abby now recalled had been introduced to her collectively as belonging to Matteo's private risk management division. She had spent 11 months scheduling their quarterly review meetings. She knew all 3 names. She knew that one of them, a man named Preston, had scheduled a last-minute request 2 months ago to reschedule a call with a client he described as personal, and that the number he had called from the office line corresponded to a prepaid cell registered to a Delaware LLC that appeared on the same paperwork. Matteo's team had pulled overnight on Cresswell's shell companies. She had catalogued it at the time as routine. It was her job to catalog everything. She had a memory, like a filing system with no delete function. She walked out of the conference room and straight to Matteo's private office. She knocked once and opened the door without waiting. He was on a call. He looked up, read her face, and said into the phone, "I'll call you back," and set it down. "Preston," she said. "Your risk analyst, Preston Aldridge." Matteo went very still. 2 months ago, he made a personal call from the office line, Abby continued, her voice steady. "The number traces to a Delaware LLC that's on the Cresswell Shell Company paperwork your team pulled last night. And the paralegal downstairs just told me that someone in your organization already knew about the Wicker Park satellite operation before Fowler's report came in this morning." She looked at him. "The only way someone on your team knows what Cresswell's people know is if they've been talking to them." The silence in the office was total. Matteo stood up from behind his desk slowly. He did not look angry. He looked like a man rearranging a chessboard in his head at high speed. "Townsend," he said. Townsend appeared in the doorway in approximately 4 seconds. "Bring Preston to the secondary conference room," Matteo said. "Tell him I need his input on the financial mapping. Don't mention anything else." He looked at Abby. "And get Claudia up here." He moved around the desk toward her. He stopped close enough that she could see the exact quality of his attention when it was aimed directly at her. And it was, she thought, a genuinely extraordinary thing to be on the receiving end of. "You identified an internal leak," he said quietly. "From a phone log you processed 2 months ago." "I remember everything," Abby said. "It's not actually useful very often. It is today." He reached up, and with the same careful, unhurried precision he had used in the kitchen with the antiseptic wipe, he smoothed a strand of hair back from her bruised cheek. "Just that. Just the one gesture. You keep saving me from things I didn't know were coming. You keep saving me from things I knew were coming and couldn't stop." She looked up at him. "I think that might be a reasonable arrangement." The corner of his mouth moved. Just barely. She had worked for him for 11 months, and she had never once seen Matteo Hargrove almost smile. And the specific, private quality of it did something to the air in the room that she was going to have to think about later, when she had more than 4 hours of sleep and fewer active crises to manage. Preston Aldridge lasted 11 minutes in the secondary conference room before Claudia Reyes and Matteo's forensic accounting team extracted a complete and detailed account of 8 months of quiet information sharing with Cresswell's organization. He had been bleeding client intelligence in exchange for the cancellation of a personal debt, a different card game, a different city, the same basic architecture. The irony was so precise it was almost a kind of answer. By the time the federal financial crimes team arrived at 6 p.m., coordinated through Claudia, who had apparently been waiting for this specific moment with the patience of someone who had excellent reasons, the case had enough material to move on Cresswell's full operation. All 63 civilian debtors on the portfolio, every manufactured obligation, erased. Declan called Abby at 6:24 p.m. from the apartment in Evanston, confused and slightly annoyed about the inspection that had turned into an unexplained 2-day extension, and she told him that everything was fine, and she would explain in person, and she loved him, and to please for the love of God not go anywhere, until she came to get him tomorrow. She ended the call and sat for a long moment in the quiet of the 41st floor, which had emptied again, the intensity of the day receding like a tide going out. Matteo came and stood in the doorway of the conference room where she was sitting. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at her the way she was slowly recognizing. He looked at things that mattered to him. With the full weight of his attention, nothing held back, nothing deflected. "The position," he said finally, "is not going to be what it was." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "Executive assistant is not the right category for what you actually do. It hasn't been for some time." He came into the room and sat across from her. "You restructure how I receive information. You remember things I don't know I need until I need them. You identified a leak today that my own risk team missed." He rested his forearms on the table. "I'd like to talk about what the right structure looks like. For both of us." She processed that for a moment. "Both of us," she repeated carefully. The corner of his mouth moved again. More definitively this time. "Both of us." Abby Sutton had walked into the Hargrove building 11 months ago as a ghost, invisible, deliberately undocumented, moving carefully through the margins of a world she didn't belong to and hadn't asked to enter. She had made herself small because small was safe. Small didn't attract attention. Small kept Declan in his apartment in Pilsen and the Friday envelopes on schedule, and everything fragile and important just barely intact. She had not expected the man who owned the building to be the kind of person who found the things you were trying to hide and decided they were reasons to stay, not reasons to go. She had not expected to be seen. But here, under the pale, exhausted light of a 41st floor that still smelled faintly of coffee, and the specific crackling energy of a war that had just been won, Abby Sutton looked at Matteo Hargrove and understood, with the quiet certainty of something settling into place after a very long time in transit, that she was not invisible anymore, and for the first time in 2 years she did not want to be.